A judge mocked a black teen for daring to represent himself in court. But when the boy calmly said 6 words, "There's a video, I have it," the courtroom froze. What happened next shattered every assumption, exposed the truth, and forced a justice system to face itself. Stay with us. You won't believe how this ends. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. It started with a laugh, a low, casual chuckle from the bench, the kind of laugh you don't expect to hear in a courtroom, let alone from a judge wearing a robe meant to represent the weight of justice. But there, it was dismissive, hollow, and sharp. Not because someone said something funny, but because a young black teenager dared to stand tall in front of him, alone, without a lawyer, without fear, without apology. The judge looked down at the boy, then glanced toward the court clerk with a smirk that barely tried to hide what he was thinking. Let me guess. No representation, no plea deal. Just another mouthy kid playing. Pretend, he said under his breath, but loud enough for the room to hear. A couple of older men sitting in the back shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A woman holding her purse a little too tightly gave a weak, uncertain laugh, but the boy didn't flinch. He adjusted the collar of his navy blue blazer and said nothing. Not yet. His name was Isaiah Brooks, 17 years old, a senior at Malcolm X High School in the South Side of Chicago. By all accounts, he shouldn't have been there, standing at the defendant's table in a federal courtroom, facing charges that could change the course of his life. Assault on a public official, resisting arrest, disturbing the peace. The kind of charges that stick like tar when your skin is the wrong color and your voice isn't afraid. What made this case unusual wasn't the charges. It wasn't the judge either. It was the boy. Isaiah had turned down a court-appointed attorney, not out of arrogance, not out of pride, but because, as he later told his grandmother, "They're not gonna fight for me the way I will." That blazer he wore, it belonged to his late uncle, a man who never made it to his own trial, shot by police during a stop that never should have happened. Isaiah wasn't just walking into court. He was walking into history. The courtroom was packed. Local activists, teachers from his high school, a few reporters who had caught wind of a teenager defending himself. None of them really knew what they were about to witness. They came expecting bravery. They didn't know. They were about to see a system crack right there, under the weight of its own assumptions. Across the room, the prosecutor, David Langston, sat with his arms folded, his face a mask of indifference. He didn't prepare much for this hearing. Why would he? It was supposed to be routine. He had reviewed the arrest report. A rowdy student had shoved a school safety officer during a library lockdown. It was clean, tight, and believable because it always was, especially when the accused couldn't afford better. And so Langston smirked when Isaiah announced, "I'll be representing myself today, Your Honor." He looked at the judge like they were sharing an inside joke. Another kid thinking the Constitution was on his side. But what no one in that courtroom knew, not the judge, not the prosecutor, not even some of Isaiah's closest supporters, was that he hadn't just shown up with a blazer and a speech. He had shown up with evidence receipts, strategy A, command of law, that would have made any first-year associate pause. Isaiah had spent the last 6 months preparing for this exact moment, reading case law by flashlight when the power went out, watching trial footage at the library until closing time, studying legal arguments while his classmates crammed for prom. Because Isaiah Brooks wasn't just fighting to prove his innocence, he was fighting to be heard in a place that had already decided he didn't matter. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge adjusted his glasses and peered down again at the boy in the blazer. "Son," he said, voice oozing condescension. "You understand what you're doing here today?" "I do." "Your Honor, you understand that this is a felony hearing, that if convicted, you could be facing real time." "I understand." "You think you're ready for this?" Isaiah looked him in the eye and said calmly, "Are you?" The judge blinked, just once, but it was enough. In the back row, Isaiah's grandmother, Miss Clara, sat with her hands folded in her lap, her spine perfectly straight, her face unreadable. She had buried a son, fought off eviction, worked night shifts, and raised a grandson who never gave her one day of rest, but gave her every reason to believe. And on that day, in that courtroom, she didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just stared forward, steady, unshakable. Because she knew this wasn't just about Isaiah. This was about all the boys who never got this chance. Isaiah laid out his case with the precision of a man twice his age. He challenged the officer's version of events, pointed out contradictions in the arrest report, and requested surveillance footage that the prosecution hadn't even bothered to review. He quoted civil case precedents and municipal code citing articles with exact section numbers. He didn't shout. He didn't stammer. He didn't flinch. Every word was a needle in the courtroom's silence, but the real silence came when Isaiah ended his opening argument with 6 words that shifted the oxygen in the room. "There's a video, I have it." The prosecutor leaned forward. The judge blinked again. The gallery stirred, because this wasn't just a kid in a blazer anymore. This was a witness. This was a scholar. This was a mirror held up to the face of a justice system that had grown far too comfortable ignoring its own reflection. And in that moment, in that silence, even the judge who had laughed just 30 minutes before felt something foreign creep into his chest. Doubt. They didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. Not because Isaiah shouted, but because he prepared. Not because he looked the part, but because he lived it. And not because he wanted to win, but because he refused to be erased. The boy in the blazer had arrived, and this courtroom would never forget him. The courtroom had settled, but the air was tight, like the stillness before a storm. Isaiah Brooks stood alone, the youngest person in the room, yet somehow the only one commanding attention. The judge had waved him forward, reluctantly granting his request to present evidence. Still, his smirk hadn't quite left. Prosecutor Langston leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, trying to hide the crack of curiosity now forming behind his rigid professionalism. But Isaiah wasn't focused on either of them. His eyes scanned the gallery, his math teacher, Mr. Grayson, his school counselor, the librarian who first handed him To Kill a Mockingbird and told him he reminded her of Atticus Finch. And in the very back, always steady, sat Miss Clara. Her presence was quiet but weighty, like the last page of a long, unfinished story. Isaiah took a breath and began not with accusations, not with anger, but with a question. What does it mean to be a threat, he asked. And who decides that? No one answered, but he hadn't asked them to. He continued pacing slowly. Because if you ask the arresting officer, it was the look on my face. If you read the police report, it was the aggressive posture of a student reaching for his backpack. If you asked the school principal, it was my tone during a question I asked about a book being banned in our curriculum. He turned to the judge. But if you ask me, it was none of those things. It was something else, something we don't put into reports because it's too uncomfortable to name. It was fear, not mine, theirs. The judge shifted in his chair. I was labeled a threat. Isaiah continued before I even knew I was being watched. And nobody asked me why I was there that day in the library. Nobody asked what I was doing, who I was helping, or even if I understood what was happening. They asked only one question: did I resist? He paused, letting the silence speak. Then he walked to the defense table and retrieved a small folder. Inside this envelope, he said, is a copy of my school disciplinary record. It's empty, not a single write-up. Not for fighting, not for talking back, not for skipping class. Ask any teacher at my school who I am, and they'll tell you I'm the one who stays behind to help others study. He handed the folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Then he reached for a second envelope. Here are 3 signed statements from students who witnessed the incident. Each one says the same thing. I didn't shove anyone. I didn't yell. I didn't resist. I stood up when asked and said, "Can you please tell me what's going on?" His voice never cracked. It didn't need to. Did anyone ask those students what they saw? Did anyone ask why I was tutoring a younger classmate that afternoon? Or why the school officer approached me before speaking to the actual student who made the noise complaint? No. Because the truth is, the questions that could have cleared this up were never asked, and the ones that were, they were loaded from the start. He let the moment sit before stepping toward the projector stand. I'd like to show the court what the surveillance camera saw. The screen blinked to life. The footage played in silence, time-stamped and grainy. It showed Isaiah seated at a table, leaning over a textbook with a younger boy, their heads closed, mouths moving. No tension, no aggression, just a high school senior giving his time to help someone else. At the top corner of the screen, a door opened. Officer Green entered fast and direct. He didn't speak to the boy. Isaiah was tutoring. He didn't wait. He walked straight to Isaiah, grabbed his arm. And when Isaiah instinctively stepped back, his backpack half on one hand up, Green tripped over a chair leg. He caught himself but stumbled into a shelf. Then he turned and cuffed Isaiah. No push, no violence, just fear. Misread and weaponized. The courtroom was still. Not even the judge smirked. Now Isaiah walked to the center of the room. The video doesn't have sound, he said. But I remember every word. I said, I don't understand. What did I do? And Officer Green said, stop resisting. I wasn't. But that didn't matter. He turned back toward the judge, because it was already written. The moment I stood up, the moment I looked surprised, it was written. I was no longer a student. I was a suspect. The silence was longer this time. Prosecutor Langston cleared his throat, fumbling for a response. Your Honor, he said, the footage may appear benign, but it does not capture the full context of Officer Green's experience. Officers are trained to act quickly when they perceive a threat. Isaiah interrupted his tone, still composed. Isn't it dangerous when fear becomes the only context? Langston opened his mouth again, but didn't speak. Isaiah continued. I'm not here to disrespect officers. My cousin is one. I know how hard that job is, but there's a difference between being afraid and being justified. And when the law allows fear to speak louder than facts, none of us are safe. Especially not kids who look like me. He picked up another sheet of paper. I'd like to request that Officer Green be called to testify in person. I have a list of questions for him. Questions that weren't asked during the initial investigation. The judge hesitated. He looked down at the footage again, then back at the file in front of him, then at Isaiah. You'll have that opportunity, he said finally. Motion granted. And just like that, a trial that had been expected to end in a single hearing had transformed into something else entirely. A challenge, a reckoning. Isaiah returned to his seat. The courtroom was still, but the energy had shifted. He was no longer the defendant in a blazer. He was a voice, clear, methodical, and impossible to dismiss. In the back row, Miss Clara finally exhaled, not because it was over, but because she could see what was coming. Isaiah wasn't there to prove them wrong. He was there to ask the questions no one else had dared to and make them answer. The next morning, Courtroom 4A in downtown Atlanta was already half full before the clock struck 9. But it wasn't the kind of crowd that gathered for justice. It was the kind that gathered for spectacle. The hallway buzzed with whispers. That's the kid who made the judge freeze yesterday. He's representing himself. They say he's just 17. Inside the chamber, the energy had changed. Something about the previous day, the footage, the calm clarity of Isaiah's voice, the way he held the room, had shifted the atmosphere. Even Judge Morrison, who had worn sarcasm like a second robe the day before, entered with a more measured expression. He didn't joke when he sat down. He didn't glance at Isaiah with the same air of dismissiveness. It wasn't quite respect, but it was no longer mockery either. Isaiah stood quietly at the defense table, dressed in the same navy blazer. He hadn't brought a crowd. No press team, no entourage, just a second-hand briefcase from a local thrift store and a single notepad worn at the edges from weeks of scribbled notes and courtroom strategy videos watched in the dark. Miss Clara was there. Her hands folded, eyes steady. She didn't move much, but every breath she took carried the weight of someone who'd once stood in courtrooms for very different reasons. She had marched for the right to sit at a lunch counter. Now she sat in a courtroom, watching her grandson demand the right to be seen as human. Calling the matter of the state versus Isaiah Brooks, the clerk announced. The prosecutor, Thomas Langston, rose with the same stiffness he'd carried before. But there was something else now. Caution. Yesterday, he had underestimated Isaiah. Today, he approached the bench like someone who wasn't sure where the ground beneath him would shift. Next, Your Honor, he began. Per yesterday's motion, the defense has requested a testimony from Officer Darren Green. We have complied. The officer is present and ready to testify. The bailiff opened the door, and Officer Green entered. He looked younger than most expected, late 30s, cropped hair, crisp uniform, but with the posture of someone who knew eyes were watching. He took the stand, swore in, and adjusted his collar like it might choke him. Isaiah approached the podium slowly. No rush, no aggression, just a stillness that had become his signature. Officer Green, he said calmly, I'm going to ask you a few questions. Please answer honestly and directly. Can you confirm that on March 3rd, you responded to a call at Northside High School regarding a noise complaint in the school library? Yes, Green replied. And the complaint was about loud behavior between two students? That's correct. Isaiah nodded. Did you speak to the student who made the complaint? Green hesitated. No. The principal had identified a possible source of the disruption. Which was me? Yes. Without speaking to the complainant, you approached me. Why? Because you match the description, Green said flatly. Isaiah didn't blink. What was the description? A black male around 6 feet wearing a gray hoodie. He nodded slowly. Officer Green, how many students at Northside High would you estimate fit that description on any given day? Langston objected. Speculative, overruled. Judge Morrison said surprising, even himself. Green shifted. I don't know. Maybe a dozen. So you had a 1 in 12 guess. Isaiah said, Did you observe me yelling? No. Did you see me touch or threaten anyone? No. Isaiah's voice lowered slightly more intimate now. Did you say anything to me before grabbing my wrist? Green looked toward the prosecutor, then back at Isaiah. I said, Come with me. Do you think that's sufficient cause to use physical force? It wasn't force, Green said defensively. I reached to guide you. To guide me, Isaiah echoed, a 17-year-old student sitting at a library table with his backpack still on. What was the urgency? Green opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Isaiah stepped forward, just enough to shrink the space between them. Officer Green, I'm not here to embarrass you. I'm here because the story told about me could have put a record on my name forever. One that says I was violent, that I pushed an officer, that I resisted arrest, but none of those things are true. You and I both know that. Green looked down at his hands. They weren't steady, Isaiah continued. If I hadn't asked to see the footage, would you have corrected your report? The room was so quiet, you could hear the clock ticking. I don't know, Green admitted. The judge leaned back, watching his fingers, had stopped scribbling notes. Langston looked pale. Miss Clara hadn't moved a muscle. Thank you, Officer Green, Isaiah said and turned to the bench. Your Honor, I rest my case for the defense. The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no cheering, no drama, but something unspoken passed through the room, a deep, resonant silence that felt like acknowledgement. It was as if in that moment everyone understood that truth had just walked in uninvited but undeniable. The judge cleared his throat. The court will take a short recess before rendering a ruling. As people began to rise, Isaiah sat down quietly at the defense table. His shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. He glanced back toward Miss Clara. She didn't smile, but her eyes, wet with tears, said everything. In that courtroom, Isaiah hadn't just defended himself. He had reminded everyone loudly, clearly, and without apology, that truth doesn't need permission to enter the room. It just needs someone brave enough to carry it in. When the courtroom doors reopened after recess, there was no dramatic music, no storm outside, just the rustling of coats and quiet footsteps as people returned to their seats, a hush falling over the room like a velvet curtain. Isaiah Brooks sat still at the defense table, his blazer unwrinkled, his fingers folded loosely in front of him. If he was nervous, he didn't show it, but deep in his chest, his heart beat slow and heavy, like a drum, keeping time in a march he'd been walking his whole life. Judge Morrison entered a few minutes later, expression unreadable, but something in his gait had changed, less rigid, more deliberate, as if each step carried the weight of what had just unfolded. He didn't look at Isaiah. At first, he looked at the stack of papers on his bench, then at the gallery, then finally at the boy in the navy blazer who had walked into his courtroom alone and had somehow turned the narrative inside out. "This court is now back in session," he said. The usual authority was there, but it wavered beneath the surface. He cleared his throat, glanced once toward the prosecution, then back at the defense. "Before I issue my ruling, I want to address the record and the room." People shifted forward slightly. A reporter's pen paused mid-scribble. Even Prosecutor Langston sat straighter, uncertain of what was coming. "The matter before this court has been presented in a manner I did not expect," Morrison said slowly. "The defendant, Mr. Brooks, chose to represent himself. That choice, though unusual, was not without precedent. What was without precedent, at least in my courtroom, was the composure, clarity, and preparation with which he did so." He looked directly at Isaiah. "Now, you asked this court not just to hear you, but to listen. And we did." Isaiah didn't blink. Judge Morrison continued. "The prosecution's case built upon the initial incident report and subsequent statements by Officer Green has now been fundamentally challenged by multiple forms of evidence. The surveillance footage, witness statements, and the officer's own testimony today." He paused his fingers, tapping the edge of his bench once, just once. "It is the opinion of this court that the prosecution has failed to meet the burden of proof required for a conviction. Furthermore," he added, and his voice shifted slightly softer but firmer in its conviction, "this court believes the charges brought against Mr. Brooks should have never reached this courtroom." Langston's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Judge Morrison picked up his gavel. "In light of the evidence presented, the inconsistencies in the officer's report, and the strength of the defense's case, I hereby dismiss all charges against Isaiah Brooks. The case is closed." The gavel came down, not like thunder, like truth. A clean, heavy sound that cracked through decades of silence. For a second, no one moved. Not the court clerk, not the gallery, not Isaiah. The sound of the gavel lingered longer than it should have suspended in the collective breath of the room. When Isaiah finally inhaled, it was sharp, like he'd been holding it for hours, maybe years. Miss Clara stood, not dramatically, not to draw attention. She stood the way she always had, in quiet defiance of everything that ever tried to keep her seated. Her hand rested gently on the wooden divider between gallery and defense, not shaking. Just sure. Isaiah turned slowly. Their eyes met. She didn't cry this time. She smiled. And in that smile was every story she'd ever told him. Every march. Every hymn. Every night she sat at the kitchen table grading papers just to make enough to keep the lights on while she taught him about dignity with nothing but patience and love. He stepped out from behind the table and walked toward her. not because he was done, but because she was why he started. As they embraced, the room began to stir. A quiet applause began, not thunderous, not eruptive, but rising like a tide. A few people stood. Then more, not because a case had been dismissed, but because something else had been recognized. The truth had walked in, and it hadn't flinched. Outside, the steps of the courthouse filled with murmurs and media. But Isaiah didn't stop for cameras. He walked beside Clara, one hand still gripping his worn briefcase, as if to remind himself that this wasn't a finish line. It was a threshold. They didn't speak until they reached the street. "Proud doesn't even cover it," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure I'd make it through," Isaiah admitted. "Not until the last second. You didn't just make it," Clara said. "You made them see that's not survival." "Isaiah, that's legacy." The next morning, the city woke up to headlines. They weren't used to reading "Teen defends himself in court wins, case after explosive footage released." The local station ran clips of the trial, but it was the still image that made its way across screens and social feeds. A black teen standing tall, alone at the defense table, unshaken. And people didn't just share it. They asked questions. They remembered his name. But the most important reaction didn't come from social media or press. It came from the communities, where Isaiah's story echoed the loudest. The kids who looked like him, the families who had sat in too many courtrooms like that, one waiting for justice that never showed up. At a community center in East Point, a poster went up that week, just Isaiah's photo and 4 words underneath: "Prepare, speak, stand, change." The gavel had fallen. But what shook that day wasn't just a courtroom. It was the illusion that the system couldn't be challenged, and one boy in a blazer had just proved otherwise. Weeks passed, but the sound of that gavel still lingered, not as a final note, but as a tremor rippling outward. Isaiah Brooks hadn't just walked out of courtroom 4B with his name cleared. He had left something behind: an imprint, a question, a shift. In the corridors of the courthouse, in quiet offices where judges drafted opinions and clerks organized files, his name now surfaced, not with pity or suspicion, but with pause and reflection. Not because he'd shouted, but because he hadn't. Not because he fought fire with fire, but because he fought assumption with truth. Judge Morrison, once dismissive, had begun showing up early. He reviewed cases with more care. He interrupted fewer defendants. He asked more questions and made fewer assumptions. One day, he paused longer than usual before passing a sentence on a young man with tired eyes and no lawyer. And then he did something rare. He asked the young man to speak, because somewhere deep down, he remembered the boy in the navy blazer who reminded him that justice starts with listening. Across Atlanta, young people who had never dared step into a courtroom unless required began doing something different. They asked how courtrooms worked. They downloaded PDFs of the Bill of Rights. They watched Isaiah's case on YouTube and shared it with captions like, "This is how you do it," or "He spoke for us." A school counselor in DeKalb County started a weekend class called Stand and Speak, using Isaiah's trial as a case study. And in East Point, the recreation center ran out of seats the day Isaiah showed up, no longer a defendant, but a mentor. But the echo that truly mattered wasn't in institutions or headlines. It was in the quiet moments, in the way Miss Clara smiled as she walked through her neighborhood and heard her grandson's name spoken with admiration. In the way a younger cousin asked Isaiah if he could help him write a speech for a school debate. in the way Isaiah started receiving letters, not fan mail, but folded pieces of lined paper from teens he'd never met. "How did you stay calm?" one asked. Another wrote, "They say the system's rigged. You proved it's not unbeatable." Isaiah didn't think of himself as a hero. Heroes wore capes or made history books. He was just a boy who studied hard because silence had cost his family too much already. But what he had done, what he could not deny, was light a path, not a blaze, just enough light for the next kid to see the cracks in the wall and know exactly where to place their hands to push. And long after the cameras stopped flashing and the headlines moved on, the echo remained. Not as noise, but as direction, as memory, as proof that justice doesn't have to be loud to be heard. Isaiah Brooks walked into that courtroom with nothing but his truth, a blazer that didn't quite fit, and a quiet resolve that generations before him had carved into his bones. What began as a routine hearing, an 18-year-old black teen accused of assaulting a police officer, quickly unraveled into something far bigger. Isaiah didn't just defend himself. He dismantled a lie, challenged a system, and forced an entire courtroom, judge, jury, and spectators alike to look past assumption and finally see the person standing in front of them. He stood alone, but he never wavered. With calm precision, he used surveillance footage, cross-examinations, and evidence the prosecution never bothered to gather to expose the cracks in the narrative built against him. Each document he presented, each question he asked, chipped away at the illusion that power always tells the truth. In the end, the very judge who mocked him would be left speechless, forced to confront not just his own bias, but the quiet courage it takes for a teenager to face injustice and refuse to blink. But Isaiah's victory wasn't just legal. It was generational. He didn't win because the system worked for him. He won because he worked through the system unflinchingly, armed with knowledge and integrity. His grandmother, Miss Clara, knew that strength. She had carried it through the marches, the threats, the whispers in the South that told people like her they didn't belong. And now she watched it reborn in her grandson, not in protest signs or slogans, but in calm defiance and truth told straight and unwavering. What Isaiah proved is simple, yet revolutionary. Dignity is a form of resistance. Preparedness is power. And justice doesn't require loud voices, but clear ones. In a world that still rushes to judge black boys by what they wear, how they speak, or where they come from, Isaiah flipped the script, not by shouting over the noise, but by making the room listen in silence. And that's the lesson we carry forward. Your voice matters, but your preparation gives it weight. Don't wait for someone to give you a platform. Build one. Know your rights. Know your worth. Teach the next generation not just to survive the system, but to challenge it with truth, with discipline, and with pride. Because the courtroom isn't the only place where judgment happens. It happens in boardrooms, classrooms, sidewalks, and headlines. And in each of those spaces, we have a choice to repeat the cycle or to rewrite it. If Isaiah's story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you know or someone you used to be, then help us continue sharing stories that matter. Subscribe to the channel, share this video, and leave us a comment about what this meant to you, because this isn't just content, it's a call to reflection, to justice, and to community. And trust us, we're just getting started.